I'm coming to you a few minutes late this morning. I had something come up just as I was getting ready to turn on the camera, but problem solved and we're moving forward. And this is another moving forward edition of Elmira Baptist Church's update. It's Tuesday, November 17th. We're more than halfway through this month of November. Looking forward to December coming up. And these holiday times are often a special time for families. I understand it's going to be different for many of us this year. Not having the ability to travel and even maybe not having family and friends who live nearby over, but God's grace will be sufficient for all things, and I will continue to pray for you. You please continue to pray for me. This week I want to continue to read a short selection from the book From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya by Ruth Tucker, highlighting some missionaries that you probably know nothing about, but that I believe one day will hear the Father say, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant," if they haven't heard it already. So let me read to you today from Maude Cary's testimony. By the early 20th century, women were equaling or outnumbering men in most mission societies, and in some countries the mission work would have virtually collapsed had it not been for single women. Such was the case for a time in Morocco with the Gospel Missionary Union. One of the 5 Protestant missions in that country, the Gospel Missionary Union, or GMU, had struggled since 1894 to reach the Muslims with the gospel. Despite these efforts, there was little visible progress against the seemingly impenetrable wall of Islam, and discouragement as well as disease took its toll on the missionary force. For some, the logical conclusion would have been to close the mission stations and concentrate on other fields. But the single women, among them Maude Cary, remained and served with unusual distinction during a difficult time. Her story is as relevant as it intersects with missions to Muslims, and perhaps even more so as it relates to her personal life. Cary was born on a Kansas farm in 1878 and was introduced to missions by the traveling evangelists and missionaries who frequently conducted meetings in the Cary home. Her mother, an independent woman, was a talented musician who had trained at the Boston Conservatory of Music and an outstanding Bible teacher as well. Maude inherited this independent spirit, and at the age of 18, she enrolled at the GMU Bible Institute in Kansas City, Missouri, to be trained for a ministry in overseas missions. In 1901, she sailed to Morocco with 4 other GMU missionaries to begin her 50 years of service there. 50 years. World War I, Great Depression, World War II, 50 years of service. The first months were devoted to language school, and from the beginning, there was evidence of personality friction between her and the other students. A bright and competitive student, she was not about to be outscored by the others, including F.C. Enyart, the only male in the small class. Although Enyart was as competitive as she was, he felt that since he was male, it was his prerogative to maintain the highest grades in the class, and in fact, he outscored her by a fraction of a percentage point. But it was she who was accused of pride and aggressiveness. On one hand, women needed to be independent and courageous enough to forsake all for a missions career. But on the other hand, it was expected that they would accept their secondary status alongside men. Cary, however, recognizing the error of her ways, prayed daily, according to her biographer, quote, "for cleansing from the sin of pride," end quote. Cary's first summer in Morocco was filled with new experiences. It was the mission policy to spend the summer months doing itinerant evangelistic work in the villages, and it was an exciting time as the missionary caravan started out into the rural areas. The excitement soon faded, however, as the harsh realities of the primitive camp life became apparent. And the difficulty in presenting the gospel proved even more frustrating. Every family kept, quote, "a pack of fierce dogs whose bite was worse than their bark. But even when they were held back from attacking the foreign visitors, they would bark noisily in the background," end quote, drowning out what the missionaries were trying to say. Despite the obstacles There were encouraging times, especially for the women missionaries who, once outside the village, were able to talk with the women at a river or spring where they carried water or washed their clothes. Many listened with interest. Quote, "But if a man appeared in the distance, the women melted away, apparently fearful of being caught listening to the heretics." End quote. More threatening than the dogs or the men who occasionally caught their wives conversing with the missionaries was the general political situation in Morocco that soon turned against the missionaries, forcing them to relocate near the coast. Work continued, but not without heartache for Cary. At the Field Mission Conference following her second year in Morocco, one of the meetings was open to group discussion on the topic of grievances and complaints that the missionaries had toward each other. According to her biographer, she soon found herself to be the brunt of much of the criticism. Quote, "From all that was said, her first 2 years on the field had been a total failure. The mission would have been better off without her. She was selfish and forgetful. She had written at least one unspiritual letter. She didn't always pray with the Muslims to whom she witnessed. Friendliness and laughter, enjoyment of life, these had all been misconstrued. Added to her tendency to idle talk and her pride of dress, they became a mountain over which her co-workers had stumbled." End quote. Within weeks after that devastating meeting, the president of the GMU, who was visiting Morocco at the time, advised her to prepare to return home. Her health problems, along with her personality quirks, combined to make her a greater liability than an asset to the mission. She was crushed. How would she ever face her family and friends back home? Ironically, the ordeal she endured relating to her pride, both during her language school days and again at the annual field meeting, was not an unusual or isolated occurrence for women in missions. Many other single women encountered similar circumstances. The very qualities that made them supremely capable for missionary service were viewed with suspicion by their weaker sisters and were threatening to their male colleagues. Isabel Kuhn, in her book By Searching, tells of a similar experience when she was applying for missionary candidacy to the China Inland Mission. On the basis of a personal preference, she was charged with being proud, disobedient, and likely to be a troublemaker. Though she was conditionally accepted, her departure for China was delayed, allowing the council time to keep an eye on her. She was promised that if she conquered her problems, she would be fully accepted. In Cary's case, she was already on the field, and sending her home would have been devastating. In the end, she was allowed to stay. There would, however, be more humiliating experiences ahead of her. In addition to her language study in Arabic, she was studying the language of the Berbers, an ancient tribe that inhabited the area long before the Arabs moved into North Africa. She had worked with this tribe before her relocation near the coast. But as she struggled with the language, she searched her motives, wondering if she would be so interested in going back to those people if it were not for a single male missionary, George Reed, who was working among them. She and Reed had corresponded with each other, and she secretly hoped her study of the Berber language would further stimulate his interest in her. It apparently did, and soon after the 1907 field conference, they became engaged. But whether because of her ill health or a combination of reasons, Reed soon had second thoughts. He encouraged her to return to the United States, and when she refused, he returned to work with the Berbers without her, though not officially breaking off their engagement. Still single on her 30th birthday, she, according to her biographer, quote, chose a new motto for her life. It was "Seek Meekness," chosen, in part at least, because George Reed said he wanted a humble wife. End quote. But humility or not, the marriage never took place, though she was to be strung along for 6 more years before she would know for sure. In 1914, George Reed decided to leave Morocco and open a new work in the Sudan, a decision that may have been precipitated by a seeming inability to call off the engagement, and his departure signaled the end of their relationship. Only then did she reluctantly accept her fate, spending the rest of her life, as she put it, as an old maid missionary. After 23 years, Cary returned home for her first furlough, still wearing the same style dress and hat she had worn when she left the United States in 1901. America was reveling in the roaring 20s, and she seemed entirely out of place. Yet it was time to care for her aged parents, both of whom died during her first furlough, and it was also a time for reflection. What had she accomplished in those 23 years? Had churches been founded? Were mission schools filled with eager students? Were converts evangelizing their own people? No. In terms of outward success, very little had been accomplished against the power of Islam. And of the handful of converts, the most promising one had turned away from the faith in the face of persecution. Was it truly worth the sacrifice? She was convinced that it was, and beside, at 47, she was now alone, her parents having both passed away, and the only home she really knew was Morocco. Back in Morocco, after her first furlough, the very slow progress of the previous decade seemed to be starting to reverse itself, and Cary began to see signs of success. More women were openly defying their cultural mores and coming out for Bible teaching. Likewise, there were 2 young male converts whose courageous stand inspired the whole Moroccan missionary community. But despite her optimism, the GMU missionary force continued to dwindle, and new recruits were few in number. By 1938, she found herself alone with one other single missionary to man the GMU stations in that most discouraging field of service. 2 more women arrived just before the outbreak of World War II, but then the doors were closed. It was a troubling time. The 4 single women might have isolated themselves in an out-of-the-way station and waited out the war. Instead, they split up in order to keep the 3 stations in operation, Cary and the other more experienced missionary, each to a station by themselves, and the 2 new missionaries working together. Finally, in 1945, the war was over, and surprisingly, according to Cary's biographer, the work had suffered very little, thanks to the faithful, sacrificial labors of our single women who chose to remain on the job. Following the war, new GMU missionary recruits began entering Morocco, 11 by 1948, and most impressive of all, 3 of them were men. Cary, now the mission's elder stateswoman, conducted language school and helped new recruits become situated, but her pioneering days were still not over. Plagued by a shortage of workers, the GMU assigned her at the age of 71, accompanied only by a young woman still in language study, to open the city of El Habab to resident missionary work. Elsewhere, the work also went forward, and in 1951, a Bible Institute was organized to train young Moroccan men. 3 students were enrolled, 2 of whom were from her new station in El Habab. Although the Bible Institute had long been a dream of Cary's, she was not present at its dedication in January of 1952. Some months before, she had been flown back to the United States for medical treatment. No one expected her to return, but late that year, at the age of 74, she was back and once again involved in the work. For 3 years, she continued her ministry, but due to recurring health problems, the mission began arranging for her retirement. Her departure in 1955 coincided with the end of the French occupation of Morocco and an exciting new era of relaxed restrictions against missionaries. For 12 years, the missionaries worked openly and freely among the Muslims, and many responded. Some 30,000 of them enrolled in correspondence courses, and Bible studies flourished. But the good times were not to last. In 1967, the Moroccan government closed the door to all foreign missionaries. 75 years of service ended for the GMU. Radio broadcasts continued to beam the gospel to those who would listen, but for all practical purposes, the tiny Moroccan church was on its own. In that same year, 1967, back in the United States, an obituary appeared in the local newspaper, and a small handful of people, 7 of whom were ministers, attended the funeral. There were only 2 sprays of flowers and hardly any tears. Maude Cary had gone to be with her Lord. This particular biography of Cary shows us some of the heartbreaks of the mission field, the long and seemingly fruitless efforts, the struggles with oneself, with one's own personality, the struggles with other missionaries, the struggle with governments, and finally the struggle with a lack of recognition. But again, the recognition missionaries are working toward is from our Master. That compliment, well done, thou good and faithful servant. Well, on to the news. This past Sunday, we met inside Sunday school at 9:45, morning worship at 11, and evening worship at 5. We had more first-time visitors, both Sunday morning and Sunday night. And this continues a streak of visitors almost every Sunday since the middle of summer. And this is visitors despite the pandemic, despite the COVID concerns. So we praise the Lord for his goodness to us. Now this coming Sunday, we'll have our Sunday school again at 9:45. Scotty Sanderson will pre-record his lesson. And for those of you who are at home, you can watch it online. And then we'll meet again at 11. This Sunday, however, we're going to have a picnic on the grounds following the morning worship service. Bring your food, something that you can eat, drink, bring your plates, utensils, whatever you might need for your meal. And if you choose to share, that's up to you, but we won't spread this out and make it a potluck. And then after the picnic on the grounds, we'll have an afternoon service about 1:45. It'll be our monthly praise and testimony time. And I've encouraged those of you who went to the 2-minute warning, men, plan to give a testimony about that. Ladies, you had a ladies' prayer breakfast this last Saturday. Plan to give a testimony about that. Of course, we'll take other praise and testimony as the Lord leads you. Did you sign up for Singspiration? That's 2 Sundays away, Sunday night, the 5th. We're looking forward to that Singspiration time, and I hope that you will sign up and present some music, some reading, some scripture that has encouraged you recently. A couple of prayer requests. Pray for Brenda, who suffered a stroke over the weekend. And she is doing better. I understand she should be home by this evening, if she's not home already, and she is recovering well. So continue to pray for Brenda. Pray for those folks in our church, older folks that just cannot get out. Many of them almost never even get to the store. If they do, they go at an odd hour so they can avoid people, and I understand their concern for their health, but pray for them. It's got to be difficult being there by yourself or maybe with just another family member all day, every day. So pray for them. Our devotional today is from Luke chapter 12. So if you have a Bible, please grab it and turn with me to Luke chapter 12 and verse 15. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus says, "Take heed and beware of covetousness. For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth." Take heed and beware of covetousness. Covetousness kills gratitude. Covetousness kills gratitude because you cannot be thankful for something when you really want something else. Whether it's a house, a car, a different spouse, different children, maybe a new job or some piece of tech, some bright, shiny object. Listen, you can't be thankful for what you have if you're really wishing for something else. So covetousness kills gratitude. Therefore, Christians must identify and mortify covetousness. Kill covetousness before covetousness kills gratitude. Colossians 3:5 says, "Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. There is no place for covetousness in the Christian's life. Now, Jesus tells us here that a man's life does not consist of the things which he possesses. Covetousness tells me that my life will be happy, my life will be better, I'll be a more fulfilled person if I only had some object, some person, some relationship. That's what covetousness tells me. As just a small example, when I was a boy, upper elementary school, I really wanted a dictionary. I loved words. I loved looking up words. These were the pre-internet days, and if you came across a word you did not know the meaning of, you had to open up a large book that was filled with definitions. We called it a dictionary. And I asked my parents for a dictionary. I said, listen, if you'll just give me the dictionary, this is all I want for Christmas. And my parents, they went above and beyond. They got a Merriam-Webster's unabridged third edition dictionary. Huge, thick book. I still have it today. And I like it. But you know, it didn't make me happy. I thought it would. I thought it would be that thing that, okay, I finally got what I wanted. But it doesn't make us happy. That's why we have to mortify covetousness. We've got to quit thinking that if we just had that one thing, we would truly be happy. And then, once we mortify covetousness, once we've killed it, once we've ended it, then we can truly be happy. We're going to be speaking more about gratitude, obviously, this week and next as we come up to Thanksgiving Day. But if we're going to be grateful, we can't be coveting. We'll be online again tomorrow at 7 o'clock, and I'll continue to talk about genres in the Bible, specifically wisdom literature. I hope that you'll be there for the live stream at 7 o'clock tomorrow.